Welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Ed. Today I'm going to try and keep my voice a little bit low because of the topic we're going to be talking about here today. But first, we still always got to start a session by doing an introduction. So again, today, very slowly and calmly. Also, today is going to be a solo edition. So it's just going to be myself and my drum. I'm going to put him nicely here so you can listen to me. All right. So what are we talking about today? Again, welcome to Let's Talk Ed with Professor Chris. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive. We're going to be unveiling some shadows. So what shadows do you think I'm talking about? We're talking about plagiarism. Very big word. Plagiarism. So just in case you're wondering why plagiarism, I'll give you a little backstory and also why it is a hot topic. If you're paying close attention to recent news, you will probably have heard of the name Dr. Claudine Gay. Dr. Claudine Gay was the first black female president at Harvard. And I'm not going to get into all the politics, but recently had to resign due to some allegations of plagiarism, among other things. But since the focus is on plagiarism, we'll leave it as that. Okay. So this then became a very hot topic. Why? Because people were wondering, how can she lose a job because of plagiarism? So, while it was very sad to see how all this played out, I must agree, plagiarism is a big deal. Because usually students ask me, really? So we're going to dive right into it. What is plagiarism? Let's take a moment to see if we understand plagiarism. Again, I did tell you, it's a very big word. But what is it? What is it that gets us so much into trouble on all different levels, different angles? If right now I said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, and I didn't say this was by the legend Bob Marley, it won't be a big deal. I'm not going to get myself in trouble. If I say, don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you could do for this country, and it sounds good, and I would have loved to be the one who came up with this quote, but no. It was by President John Kennedy. Okay? If I said, divine love has always met every human need, and I didn't say Mary Baker Eddy, you probably don't know who it is, that, again, ladies and gentlemen, will be plagiarism. So as simple as it sounds, right, because all you have to do is just acknowledge. So hopefully, this is kind of giving you the idea of what plagiarism is. Plagiarism is copying someone else's work without giving proper credit. There's nothing attached to it. It's not saying, hey, when you borrow this person, you got to pay 50 cents. No. It just requires you to give the proper credit. What is the significance of plagiarism? Why do we say it's a big deal? On all different levels. But mainly, the significance is because of academic integrity, professional consequences, and the impact on creativity and innovation. And we'll get a little more into details on that. Okay? All right. So I already talked about, we talked about the definition of what plagiarism, once again, it is copying someone else's work without giving proper credit. I like this show. I love it. And I promise to keep doing Let's Talk Ed with Professor Chris for as long as I can. And the reason I say that is because usually when I pick a topic and I'm discussing a topic, I know students are thinking, oh, Professor Chris, maybe it's too perfect. But you forget that once I was also in your shoes. And while I do this podcast, I'm always trying to still keep myself in your shoes. So when I'm talking about plagiarism, which I've dealt with, and students, I've always told students, don't think I have never gone through this. Don't think. I actually believe at some point in time, everyone that has gone through college has plagiarized. I actually believe that. But here's the case, and here's my story. So before I tell you my story, I'm going to ask you a quick question. Have you spent weeks and weeks and weeks writing a 25-page paper, typing, must I add, with these two little fingers, all night, typing, just to find out you're getting an F on the paper? That was my story, and that was my rude awakening to plagiarism. I'm not going to make any excuses, because when I finished the paper, I had quotes, and every quote that I put in there had a quotation. So when my Civil War, why I was even taking Civil War is a whole different story. I tried to take American history. It was required. I had to take one history class. I tried to get into American history. It was full, so I ended up with Civil War. But when my professor for the Civil War called me into his office to not only tell me he was giving an F on the paper, but wanted to actually let me know why he did that, he opened to page 3 of my paper and said, Chris, did you realize you plagiarized? And I must admit, I've probably had plagiarizing before, but this was the first time that it really sounded big to me. I was like, what? Say, who? So you've plagiarized. I said, how? No way. He said, yes, you have your quotes in quotation, but you did not state where it came from. And to my defense, I said, the fact that it's in quotes means it's not mine. Right? And then he said, well, that still doesn't mean you're not plagiarizing. Fortunately for me, he actually gave me a second chance, but that was a very rude awakening, and that is my story on plagiarism. Guess what? I had a second chance to redo the paper. I probably ended up with a B on that paper, but I learned a very, very hard lesson from that. So, that is my story of plagiarism. Now, let's talk about the thought process. What is the psychology of plagiarism? What goes through your mind, or what gets students? Again, I focus more on students, but it's across the board. I've seen presidents, head of states, ministers plagiarize all the time. But let's just focus on the students, okay? What goes through your mind, or what leads you into plagiarism? The motivations vary. There is the pressure to succeed. There's the lack of time management skills. If you have a paper to finish and you procrastinate and you don't get a paper done, chances are when you don't have time to finish that paper, your references are going to be direct quotes, and you're going to try as hard as possible to make it your own, and it will turn out to be plagiarizing, which is why you give yourself enough time to do that. What also goes through your mind and what could cause you to plagiarize? The fear of failure. Because you want it to be so perfect that you rather do that than get yourself out of trouble, right? The other factor is actually a cultural factor. So here in the United States, and I did this research, Plagiarism is taught very, very early in the high school level, but guess what? Yet I still see my students, when they come to college, plagiarize and fall short of plagiarism, okay? Other countries probably, and again, I'm not making an excuse, but usually when foreigners come to the US, that seems to be something very, very new to them. So it is cultural, but it's not an excuse. That's why usually it's orientation, and most orientations actually also focuses on plagiarism, right? Very early to let you know what it is, and during the semester, they kind of help you, guide you through that. The other psychological part about plagiarism is we find ways to rationalize and justify why we do it. Like most of my students will always say, Professor Chris, what is the big deal? Everybody's doing it. And this applies to other areas of analysis and calculations and manipulations where students always think, yes, what is the big deal? Then there's the ethical consideration, right? Where ethically you're thinking, okay, I know this is not the right thing to do. However, maybe just this once, right? We convince ourselves that maybe just this once we could get through it. So I kind of went through this process very quickly, but usually this is what gets us in trouble, and this is how we get in trouble, is the psychology behind plagiarism. The pressure to succeed, lack of time management, fear of failure, want everything to be perfect. And again, there's the cultural factors. And what do? We try to justify and rationalize why we plagiarize. All right, there are consequences. I open this podcast here with a great current story, which unfortunately is going to become a case study. It will be a case study, trust me, for many years. What are the consequences? I'm going to focus, there are three main areas that I will look at, but I'm going to focus more on the academic consequences because there's the legal ramifications and there's the professional consequences. But since, again, this podcast is solely for college students, I'm going to focus on academic consequences. It's very clear, academically, what the penalties are going to be. It can vary from probation to suspension. For how long also depends on the institution. But whatever the case is, I guarantee you there is a penalty for plagiarism. Why is it big on academic level? Because it could damage your reputation. If you're in research, that could be you and your advisor's reputation. Who is going to want you on any future opportunities for research? You are going to be tainted if once you're caught plagiarizing. So, do the research for your institution and find out what the consequences are for plagiarism at your institution. We do have the legal ramifications, which for some reason I think everybody knows about copyright. My 9-year-old and my 11-year-old probably know about copyright, but maybe have never heard about plagiarism. Well, let me take that back. This kid sometimes surprise me though, so. Right. But we've heard about copyright infringements, we heard about intellectual property issues, so I'm going to leave that to you to research, but that all falls under plagiarism, okay? Professional consequences is the ultimate. That means you lose your job. Case in point, my opening story. That means it damages your career, okay? So, there are consequences and there are penalties, and each of them is not good. The legal ramifications sometimes ends up in millions. So you hear entertainers, again, plagiarizing or copyright issues. So I think that's why we hear more about intellectual property issues and we hear more about copyright infringements because of the financial component that comes with it. Okay. So how do we detect plagiarism? This is where, as much as I love technology, and I think it's doing great, and sometimes I have my own issues with technology. But when it comes to plagiarism and the tools that we have out there, oh boy, it makes me love technology. Back in the day, the good old days, there was a manual method to detect plagiarism. That means your professors are reading through your papers, reading through your analysis, reading through your manipulations, your calculations, and are able to detect a pattern to say, okay, I think I've seen this before. Maybe this was copied, right? So that was the good old days where professors would take their time, and I think still happens. It's very easy for professors to detect plagiarism. Don't forget, when an instructor or your professor gives you a paper to write, they are also giving you the books that you can use for reference. Usually, these are the books that instructors have probably used for years and years and years, so they know the ins and outs of these books. Also, typically in most classes, you're going to be writing 3 or 4 papers at a time. And the professors get used to your writing style. They know your voice. I always associate voice with writing because as you think, as you speak, probably the same way you're going to write. And usually, I think this is also very interesting when I tell students this. Just as you probably are not going to find 2 people with identical voices. Yes, we all speak differently. You're not going to find 2 people with identical voices. It's the same way in writing. 2 people, it's very possible, may not have the same writing skills. Which is why most instructors know how you write. If for some reason, when you're writing, it doesn't transition, it doesn't flow too well, or all of a sudden, it transitions into something that they don't recognize as your own voice, it becomes a problem, and it is detected. Okay. The good part about technology these days when it comes to plagiarizing is all the softwares out there to make plagiarism detection very easy. When was the last time you printed out 35 pages of paper, hard copy, to your professors? Chances are your professors are going to ask you to turn those in electronically, right? The reason, again, is they just feed all those papers into the software that they have, and it's easy detection. Another way to detect plagiarism is the famous plagiarism cases, the case studies that are out there. So there's different patterns that people are accustomed to. So they know, okay, we've seen this before, this is how it plays out, it's probably plagiarism. And also there are some impacts that it's had on individuals and institutions. So we read about this here, and all contributes to how we detect plagiarism. Plagiarism. Again, I said it's a big word. All right. So the most important part as we're talking about this here, I could probably have just started on this here by saying, don't plagiarize. This is the way to prevent that. So now we're going to talk about the prevention and addressing plagiarism. On the educational level, every institution is preaching this. Okay? There are education awareness talking about teaching proper ways to do citations, how to cite your work. There's the APLs, there's Chicago, there's all these different methods that you're being taught on how to really do good references and also promoting a culture of academic honesty. Okay. So yes, there's a lot of education awareness, and hence most institutions spending a lot of time and money making sure that this is addressed. In most institutions with graduate programs, before you start your research, there's a 1 credit hour course that you have to take just focused on why you should not plagiarize, and it goes into copyrights, intellectual property, goes into all that, right, before you start your research. So yeah, that's all happening. Another way, of course, is the code of conduct, right, institutional policies, the penalties. They let you know upfront, these are the consequences of plagiarism, right, these are all institutional policies that you have to learn. And last but not the least, in prevention, is the support system. Your tutoring and writing centers are your support system. I've always said, when in doubt, if you're not sure if you're plagiarizing, just take your paper to the writing center. The editors, they are very, very good experts. They have very good support system. They will be able to tell you within minutes, after flipping 2-3 pages, to let you know that this sounds like you and this does not sound anything like you, Einstein. Okay? So take advantage of those support systems. All right. I think I have hit this home well enough so far as plagiarism goes, and us taking a deep dive into plagiarism. If there's anything that I didn't touch on, let me know, but I'm gonna close here very quickly with that. First, let's recap. I hope by now, at the very minimum, you know what plagiarism is. So there's a call to action. To be very, very careful while you're in college. Be very careful, please. Because unfortunately, it's also something that sticks around for a long time. And here's the thing with plagiarism. If you plagiarize your freshman year, don't be surprised. 15 years later, it comes up. That's the scary part about plagiarism. That when you least expect it, is when it comes out. Which is why don't do it now, because it never goes away and you don't have to ever worry about that. Help promote academic integrity. And your contribution to that is making sure you're doing your own work and you're not plagiarizing. Be original. Be original. Share a very quick, not story, but how I have been very grateful to have a very good support system. So probably for the past 10 years now, I've been writing these bi-weekly articles called The Boost. And I was very fortunate, as I mentioned, to have a good friend of mine, Mr. Jim, who I also refer to as my chief editor, who edits my Boost for me. Prior to that, my wife actually used to edit those Boosts until she got very busy. And I'm very grateful Mr. Jim was able to take over. But my wife used to edit my work, and she was able to kind of make sure that I was on track, that it was in my voice. Mr. Jim, my chief editor, always made sure that his edits were still in my voice. And that's what good editors do. So be original, and you're going to get people to help you speak in your voice. There is no gray area when it comes to plagiarism. And what I mean by that is when you're ever in doubt if what you're putting out there is plagiarizing, it is. Black or white. There's really no gray area. So if you, for a second, think, am I plagiarizing? Chances are you are. Here's my favorite one. Trust yourself and be creative so others can quote you. Well, that's by Professor Chris. That's not plagiarism. That's coming right and direct from Professor Chris. Trust yourself and be creative so others can quote you. How about that? Wouldn't it be nice for somebody else to say, hey, I like this. Let me use it in my paper and quote you, right? Bottom line, I haven't used the word yet, but I'm going to use it to close. Bottom line, plagiarism is cheating. So don't jeopardize your life. So we got cheating. Plagiarism falls under that umbrella. And underneath that umbrella is also copyrights, which again, I'm sure you're familiar with. So with that, thanks again for listening. It was just myself and my drum today, but I hope We made some good points. Be careful, be careful, be careful. And again, as I mentioned, when we talk about plagiarism, people think it's just writing. Writing happens to be one of the biggest area where plagiarism happens a lot. But I've seen it all across the board. I've called students into my office with similar work, analysis, manipulation. So it happens across the board, right? So again, be creative, be yourself. Stay tuned for the next edition of Let's Talk Ed with Professor Chris.